All right, this is the second part of the rear end video, but why am I looking at the front? It's because a friend from work had these 17 by 11 50 millimeter offset wheels he was running on his 2002 Camaro, and he had an extra one or extra few, so he threw one my way so I could at least throw it on there and get a sense for where my offset sits. So more to do on the front to figure that out. But really, he needs this wheel back in like a week and a half because he's selling it to somebody. So that means I need to get my act together and hang the rear so that I can throw that wheel on there before I have to take it back to get a sense on where the offset sits. So, so that brings us to the rear end. So what I've done is I've finished the mini tubs and kind of patched things, as I said in the last video. So right now what I've got is my super custom lift stand, which is 4 old golf cart tires and a stool holding the crossbar in. So on the SpeedTech crossbar, it kind of nestles up inside the frame rail there, and on the other side. And it's supposed to be 21 inches in front of the center of the rear spring shackle. And so what I've done is I've taken the bushing that was already in the spring shackle and stuck the bolt back in it, let it protrude, and then just took my tape measure over top of it and measured it forward and marked it. There's a little blue mark up there, and did the same on this end. So now what I need to do, now that I think it's in place, is go ahead and take this back down, hit the places that will be covered after it's welded, and with some weld through primer, and then tack it up there. And SpeedTech heavily recommends that you basically tack these up and then install the whole rear end to make sure that everything fits before you weld it in there. Because if you seam welded all the way around this, you would be basically having to remove the whole rear frame rail to get it off. So we're gonna follow what their recommendation is. All right, the janky stand I made with the golf cart tires seemed to work pretty well. So it's all in place. I've got some that weld through primer up there, tacked it in a couple of places. It seems to be about as aligned as it's gonna get. So the next check will be making sure that everything fits. So the next thing is these spring pockets, which I mentioned. These are the replacement spring pockets, and they go right up in here. They sit right up in there. I already took a look at them. You know, sometimes these replacement parts, they don't work exactly right. In this case, there's a little locating tang right there, that little tab right there. Can you get it to focus for you? That tab right there. It's a little wide, it doesn't quite fit in the square hole that they punched from the factory, and a couple of the holes are a little bit out of alignment, but that's probably just as much DM's fault as NPD's fault. So just gonna take that tab down, widen a couple of these little holes, pop it up in there, go on from there. All right, I massaged the 2 spring pockets and they fit pretty well now. I've got the dangly bits in here. There's one dangly bit, there's the other dangly bit. Those are the trailing arms that are gonna go to the rear end. So they're just kind of hanging out right now. These trailing arms are kind of interesting. First of all, you can tell they're not straight because they're trying to get in as tight as they can by the wheels. But one of the issues is the clearance on this trailing arm to this this frame rail is really tight. And in fact, I haven't got everything tightened down. Oh, mosquito. So you know, we'll see what happens when we get the rear end in and the pan hard rod in. I'm hoping I don't have to beat this frame rail with a hammer or anything like that. Hopefully it all works out. Also, an interesting feature is these are articulatable. They swivel here, and this is actually, there's probably a thread up in there, because what they tell you to do is to rotate these in and out almost like a turnbuckle to adjust the location of the wheel. So you can use this to kind of align the rear end and to shift the rear end front and rear. So when I put this in for final, I'll make sure that these are exactly the same length, both left and the right. And then we'll come on in here to the shop, and where I've got the rear end in, 9-inch rear end from Dutchman. SpeedTech is, kind of works with Dutchman, and Dutchman went ahead and welded all the brackets in their correct places, so I didn't have to get a jig. So I didn't, twist the twist or bow the rear end by welding it. So sometimes just easier to pay for somebody to do it correctly instead of trying to, you know, mess it up yourself. So strange third member with 389 gears and a Eaton posit traction with 35 splines, I believe. So that's an upgrade. So it should be more than enough for what I'm doing. Basically, I've got to get this ready because since this is a trailing arm, a torque arm setup, the torque arm, which I'll show in a minute, actually bolts here to this base, this pinion surround. And the way they do that is they provide this nice machined little collar. And so what's going to happen is I'll remove the bolts out of there, slip this down over top, and then bolt it back, and then the trailing or the torque arm will flush up against this, and then there's some adjustability in that arm. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Whew. All right, here she is with the 9-inch housing from Dutchman, the Pro Iron third member. That collar that I showed you is on there, and then the torque arm is right there. So I'll get a little closer and kind of show you what it looks like. But I'm going to tell you right now, this whole setup with the iron center section and that torque arm is quite heavy as well. This thing is chunky. It was a little rough to get this up on the thing by myself, and I was too lazy to get the engine hoist out. So yeah. But anyways, so this is kind of how it works. As I said on the last little clip, there's the little aluminum collar, goes on front of that third member closeout. And then there's the torque arm. It's got a pivot that's welded to the case back here, and it's got 2 bolts that go up under here, and it bolts into this aluminum piece. It's got a dog bone sort of setup right here, and you can slide it back and forth to adjust it because they don't know which third member you're putting in here. So this one seems to fit really well. And then if you need to adjust the pinion incidence to line up with the tail end of the transmission, you can shim under here. So I haven't gotten to that point. This is just kind of a rough fit. But this is the torque arm. It's kind of a box setup. And then basically all this is doing, it's not really resisting any longitudinal forces. That's what those trailing arms do. All it's doing is allowing the rear end to pivot around a long pivot. So what that does is it kind of keeps the alignment very neutral as you go around a turn because it's got such a long arm. And this is kind of like a little Delrin bearing. And basically this is meant to allow the rear end to kind of swing this way and swing up and down and to pivot. But it doesn't restrict it forward and aft. And I'll show you where it goes. This Delrin fits right in this socket right here under the tail end of the transmission. So it comes all the way up and it just slides in there. It's Delrin, so in theory it's self-lubricating. I might put a little silicone lubricant in there. I don't want to put grease in there because then you get road grime and it'll start grinding away at the Delrin. But yeah, pretty interesting setup. We'll see how it goes. Next thing is to kind of hang it in the car and see how it all fits. All right, boys and girls, it's hanging under the car, and I don't have the panhard rod yet in there, so I've got a little bit more mock-up to do and some adjustments to make, but I figured I'd point out a couple of things to help you guys who were trying to do the SpeedTech rear end. As I kind of pointed out on the front suspension, the instructions are poor. On the rear suspension, they're criminally poor. I mean, it has the ubiquitous statement at the front, only experienced installers should do this, but I mean, let's be honest. You can throw a few more pictures in there. They do provide one picture of the unit kind of sitting out in the open, but you can tell it's a pre-production unit because some of the stuff doesn't line up to what they've got here, so you can't even look at that. They just don't have pictures. So like for instance, right here, this rear shock hanger, which hangs off the back, they don't actually tell you how this goes. You kind of have to guess. You know, there's 3 holes. You've clearly got 2. You can sort that out. So you can do it here or here, but this will also work upside down. So which way does it go? And you know, from an engineering standpoint, if you had it upside down, you would get a lot of peeling on this piece. It would try to bend this tab away and you wouldn't get the crush that is actually holding this in place as opposed to the shear from the bolts. And so from a structural standpoint, it makes sense that this L is like this, but who knows if they knew that. So anyways, this is what we're gonna do. Also, just kind of setting it down on the jack stands, it looks like I'm gonna need to move this guy down here to kind of get this shock in the center of its travel at the desired ride height. And you can't move this without unbolting this. So luckily I'm gonna have to take this all apart anyways. But just an example of them not really giving you any idea of how to put this together. So there's how I think it goes together. You guys can let me know if I don't know. Again, they make a good product. Everything looks really high quality. Just take more than 5 minutes to put the instructions together, or just take a bunch of digital photos and just throw them up on the web. So anyways, also, again, as I mentioned on the front suspension, some forethought to where the powder coating is. There's a couple of through holes right here where this bolt goes through. And I tack welded this fitment in here. And then when I went to put the bolt through, I couldn't get it through because it was, you know, the 2 holes were jammed full of powder coat. So I should have known that. I should have seen that. But the problem was, now that it's up in the car, it's really hard to get to. You can't really get to it with a reamer on a drill. So I kind of had to get in there with a rat tail file, which is a pain. So check those out before you hang it. Let's see, anything else? Oh yeah, these adjustable end link, or these adjustable trailing arms seem to be adjusted all the way aft, so I'm gonna have to adjust those in. Here's a quick look at the trailing arm, or the torque arm right there. You can see how it's bolted at the back with that weld-on fitment. There's a little dog bone bolted to that aluminum collar, and then it runs all the way up to the front, and here's that Delrin pivot. It's kind of hanging out of the back of that socket. That's another thing that's kind of telling me maybe this needs to come forward a little bit. So, but anyways, like I said, SpeedTech makes a quality product. It seems to be well thought out. Just an extra few minutes on the instructions would make all the difference. One more quick look before I take it back out. I will just note that the instructions did have pictures. There just weren't very many, and they weren't very good. So, in case one of the SpeedTech guys find this, there are pictures, just not enough. So now, as you can tell, I've got the panhard rod in there. It's slanted down right now because the suspension is in full droop. I set everything when it was at ride height using the jack stands to do so. So setting the height of the panhard rod, and I've got a couple of plumb bobs, one right there, one on this side. There it is, hanging right there, and I used that with a ruler to adjust the panhard rod to center the rear end. Everything looks like it's going to be good. We've also got the anti-sway bar in there. It kind of comes across the back here and goes up and connects to these links. They provide these little brackets. You can either bolt them through or weld them. I might as well weld them. So that all looks to be working okay. And then a note on driveline alignment. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but it's pretty important to get the angles right on this. And there's 2 kind of critical parts. One is that you want to make sure the angle that the drive shaft makes with the center line of the transmission is identical to the angle that the drive shaft makes with the center line of the pinion. It doesn't have to be 0. It shouldn't be 0, but it needs to be the same. And there's a really good video, maybe I'll put a link in the description, of them showing how it really screws with the drive shaft and creates a lot of vibration if you don't get that right. There's also a recommendation here that you want your basic driveline angle, what that angle is. Not only does it need to be the same, but it usually needs to be within a range. SpeedTech says 0 to 2 degrees. They suggest 2 works really well for them. American Powertrain suggested 1.5 to 4. Right now, the way that the engine and transmission is sitting, it's going to end up being about 2.9, so that should be, you know, right in the wheelhouse for where American Powertrain said to be. I'm going to need to shim the rear end right here. So on top of this plate, I'll put some shims, and it'll raise the nose of this up so that this angle matches the angle of transmission. This right here was my feeble attempt to get the angle of the drive shaft. So I just tied a piece of twine there and ran it down there and set an angle finder on it. It got me, you know, within a few tenths. So anyways, now everything's got to come back out because I cleaned this all down and wiped all the underside with acetone about a week and a half ago, and it's already starting to flash rust. So I need to get my act together, pull all this stuff out, and get to painting before it rusts again. Like most of my best ideas, it's a combination of laziness and ingenuity. And so what I've done here is I've kind of made the car itself a paint booth because I'm just painting the back half underneath. I'm really trying not to have to do any touch up or anything on the outside. So I just took some plastic and taped it around the edges, so hopefully everything will be contained, and I've got plastic kind of all the way around, and I've got a slit in the back so you can get in easily, you know, as you do. Anyways, yep, so wanted to throw that up so I could protect all the rest of this priceless junk from getting paint on there. So we'll see how it works. Okay, I'm out in the spring pocket Perches for the last time. I showed you this earlier, but you can see I've added 2 holes right there where my thumb is. All of the force, because the torque arm itself doesn't react any longitudinal loads, all of the accelerating and braking forces are going to be reacted by these links and these perches. And so Speed Tech wisely added a couple of extra bolt points. The stock ones are on the tabs there, and I'll show you how those attach to the body in a second. But they basically have you drill these 2 extra 3/8 holes, and then you'll drill a hole up through the body, and then you'll bolt it from the inside. And there's a gap there, and obviously that's not the strongest thing. So what they have you do is just put some washers or a shim. What's up there normally is these little blind nuts. They're pretty beefy, but they kind of go right up in there and they slip into the frame, and then when you bolt through, it's pretty much just as strong as a normal bolt or nut, because that's what that is. So what I've got to make those shims above is I've got some bushing material left over. I'm just gonna cut it in half and then face it off with the lathe down to the length that I need it, and then those will get compressed in there, and so then it'll be 5 points, 5 bolts holding this spring perch in, which make it a lot more beefy. Just in keeping with the theme of laziness, I use my Ingersoll Rand Model 429 body saw to cut through that bushing right there, and I use my Insta-Death attachment. Beware, it works great as long as it doesn't fly off and stab you. So there's half of it, cut it off, got the other one set up in the lathe. Here's the spacer in the lathe. I'm just gonna come across and face this surface. It'll make it nice and square, get it down to the length I want. Then I'm gonna break this edge with the edge of the tool, and then I'll bring a drill bit in here and just clean up the inside. And she's all done, down to length, chamfer on the inside and out. Because of the way the pockets sit up in the frame, you gotta go ahead and put these trailing arms in there and put the bolt through it before you mount this in, otherwise you won't be able to get the bolt through. So what I've done here is, since I adjusted each side independently to center the wheel, I basically took a couple of bolts and pushed them through here to make sure they're exactly the same length. Now, at the end of the day, I'm gonna align the rear end with the 2 registration points on the car that I've chosen, but this at least tells me I'm starting from even. All right, it's back in the car. I wanted to give a quick after-action report. Kind of went in much smoother this time, just because I'd done it once before. Just kind of lifting the nose of the nose of the torque arm up, and then lowering the car, and then kind of just sliding it in there, and then bringing it up and hanging it from the rear shocks. Took a little bit of ratchet strap action here, and using the panhard rod as kind of a jacking point to kind of tweak the rear end back and forth, because getting these bolts in the rear trailing arms here, it's kind of a pain getting them to line up and double shear all the way through, but eventually it worked without too much tweaking. So all I got to do now is go through and torque all the bolts and kind of do all my pre-settings to kind of get stuff roughly in place and center the rear end with the panhard rod, and then check, hopefully I got my pinion incidence correct to go with the engine incidence. But let's just go ahead and end this video right here because it's already been long enough.